The topic for today will be about organizational change and development. Okay? And this comes after we've discussed topics on the four activities of management. So the usual PLOC, planning, leading, organizing, controlling. Now we're going to talk about change in the context of an organization. And it's quite fitting that you sort of wrap everything up in terms of management with the topic on organizational change. Because you can take a look at management with the four activities mentioned a while ago: PLOC, planning, leading, organizing, and controlling. You can view these four activities in a static manner, which is not exactly accurate. An organization can be viewed as some sort of a living organism. While it's not biologically accurate to call an organization an organism, it does have functions that mimic a typical organism. Okay? And like any other organism, organizations change. They experience progress, they experience growth, they experience regression, decay, death. And when we look at organizational change, it's quite important to view it also from the perspective of time. Understanding that organizations belong to a certain temporal world or subject to temporality. So when we were looking at organizational management principles, it's easier to look at it from a static point of view and then try to move slightly away from that static point of view to some process that is simple. So we've talked about the planning process, we've talked about the organizing process, among other things, and we've noticed that they are very linear, or they can be modeled in a linear fashion. But nevertheless, the time element in those activities, it's not very clear. It's not well defined. It's not even assumed to be that important. But now, in this topic of organizational change and development, time becomes a very important facet in this situation. And this gives us a little bit of realism to the study of organization and management in our course, especially. And I think what makes leaders very, very effective is that they have a very good understanding of how organizations change, number one, and how they as leaders can actually influence the forces of change surrounding the organization, number two. So while it might be nice to know certain processes like planning, decision making, organizing, and the likes, that's not enough. That's not going to be like your full arsenal or your complete toolkit to actually be an effective leader in any organization. You also need to have a very good understanding of changes within an organization. And that's what we're going to talk about. So, organizational change, how do we define it? Well, it is a process by which the organization moves from the present state to some desired future state to increase effectiveness. Naturally, some of us would be thinking that, well, this is probably the first time that you will notice change as a very conscious effort or initiative. Back then, changes happen left and right. The fact that you've perhaps woken up this morning, you've taken it for granted that a change happened. Okay, you're no longer the same person as you were yesterday or last week. Okay, they happen. They happen all the time. Of course, the magnitude of the change can vary, but the fact that there was change, okay, we cannot deny that. It's incontrovertible. Now, organizations change. And organizational change happens when, from a certain come from state or present state, you actually move to a desired or future state, which would then be now your new present state. So another way of looking at this is organizational change is a move from the old to the new. Simply put, you can appreciate it in that way. However, the caveat here is that you want changes to happen because you'd like to gain some benefit from the change. Okay? Now, typically, if an organization regresses, okay, or doesn't perform very well, rather than improving, it's falling. Okay, that's still some change, but that's not an organizational change that you as a leader would be curious to actually take effect, or would not be eager to make sure that that would happen. Of course, you'd like to avoid those types of changes wherein the organization regresses. Okay. Now, uh, an organizational change can also mean when an organizational system or your management system is disturbed by some internal or external forces. Okay. And these things happen at a certain level of frequency. They can happen very frequently, they can not happen very frequently, but they impact your organization to the point that something happens to the organization. So that's what happens. Now, what are the typical characteristics of organizational change? Well, change can happen based on internal forces and external forces. So things that can happen within the organization and things that can be affected by outside of the organization. Okay. Now, change in any part of the organization affecting the entire organization. So it can be people, typically leaders. If you have a change in leadership, well, there's an organizational change. If there is a change in policies or structures, organizational structures, if there's a change in technology or the tools that are being used in the organization, that is also organizational change. Okay. Or any other element of the organization. Now, change can also affect the rate of speed and degree of significance of the organization. So your change can be gradual, can be a little bit slow, perhaps boring, if you want to use that term, or it can be very fast. It can be robust. And the degree of significance would refer to how much of that change has affected the organization. It can be small, insignificant perhaps, or it can be huge. It can be impactful, okay? Or it can even be disruptive. Now, here's the last characteristic, which would be very important for us to appreciate, is that change can either be reactive or it can be proactive. Reactive would be in response to the forces that the organization is experiencing, or it can be proactive. It can be preemptive or anticipatory to some force that's not yet there, but you're expecting or projecting that something might be there. Okay. So that's how we will take a look at change as we move forward in this lecture or commentary. Now, what are the typical change forces? Well, we have internal, we have external. Internal forces, it can be your own workforce, the people inside the organization. It can be the leadership composition or managerial personnel. Or it can be management structure, how your organizational chart has changed from one period to another. There could be new departments, new offices, or there could be some offices that have been merged with another office or completely removed altogether. You can also have external change forces, technology. If you've been using some technology in the past, then now there's a newer technology that is perhaps better or cheaper compared to what you've been using. Okay, that's a change force. Marketing conditions, changes in the market, your customers, okay, the preferences, how they change. That can also be part of your external change forces. Social changes, how society has evolved, perhaps demographic changes, The older people, well, okay, I mean, they're no longer an influential market group, but now you're probably going to deal with a younger group. Okay, and political forces, governance. Okay? Those are external change forces that an organization needs to consider. Now, change agents. Now, these are the people in the organization responsible for managing change activities. Oh, they can be the leaders or managers of the organization, or they can be non-managers. Typically, uh, individuals, employees who are influential throughout an organization, but they're not holding any governance function. And a change agent can be someone who is not part of the organization, a consultant, somebody who's outsourced. Okay, those can be your change agents. Later on, you will appreciate certain differences and advantages between a manager versus a non-manager versus an outsider who's a change agent. Okay, so there are pros and cons, but nevertheless, a change agent can be any one of these three. Now, what are the things to consider when we want to consider speed of change? Now, change we know is a movement from an old state to a new state. That's change, but part of it is the passing of time. Okay? Now, what are the things that we want to consider? Well, urgency. How urgent is the change? Another factor to consider would be the degree of support. Naturally, if the support, especially coming from key stakeholders and management, would be very high, then you would expect that the speed of change to be rapid. Of course, the amount of change that needs to be done and the underlying complexity that can also define or determine how fast the change would occur. Your external environment, how easy it is for you to make some adjustments in responding to the environment once the change is over. That will also determine your speed of change. Other things like skills, knowledge, and other resources that also define how fast change can occur. Now, why is this important to know this particular list? Well, sometimes change agents, they tend to only focus one or two things, one or two factors, okay, when it comes to change. Maybe they're just looking at the competitive environment, for example. Or maybe they're just looking at the amount of money that's required to effect the change. They're not considering everything else. Okay? That becomes dangerous on the side of the change agent because they might be advocating a certain pace to have that change, but the organization isn't ready enough to accept the change. The change readiness becomes more suspect. And that's important to a change agent to appreciate that it's not just a matter of making the change. There you go. No, it's about understanding that when you actually do the change actually occurs. Okay. And there's this reason why a change agent must be very, very susceptible. Well, not susceptible, but very, very aware or sensitive to what we would call resistance to change. It's natural. Not everyone would accept immediately the change that you would be proposing if you are the change agent. Or if management proposes this change, not everyone would appreciate it. When you go and work inside an organization, in a company, you will experience lots of changes in varying degrees and intensities. Okay? And your resistance to these certain changes can actually fluctuate. Sometimes you would accept the change immediately, therefore no resistance. Or you can be so resistant to the change that you'd probably make active resistance to all efforts for that change. Okay, that can go that way. Now, the effort to block new ways of doing things, you can look at it at three levels. You can look at it at the level of the individual, you can look at it at the level of the group, or you can look at it at the level of the entire organization. So let's take a look at the individual resistance first. So what are the reasons why certain individuals would be resistant to change? There could be a whole slew of reasons, right? Economic factors. For example, if the company decides not to increase salaries. In the Philippines, salary deduction is not legal as far as automatic, or unconsented deduction of salary is concerned, right? It's not legal in the Philippines. In the US, that's possible. So you can actually get some pay cuts in the US without you having to say anything about it, right? But in the Philippines, that's not allowed. But supposing there's no salary increase, but you've had a recent event, like somebody got sick, or if you have children, you need to pay for tuition for the upcoming school year. Okay, there will be some resistance to that. Okay, maybe you'd probably clamor that certain inflationary increases would still be done. Okay, that's quite possible. What about habits? Maybe you got used to doing things and then a new process will disrupt your habit. So instead of filling up form XYZ, this time you need to fill up form ABC, which is completely different. Okay, so there's going to be some resistance because you may have developed a habit which made it easier for you to go through that process. Insecurity is another reason. Because change, when they're introduced, there's a lot of uncertainty that is embedded in that change. Okay, while in theory you might be given some information on the benefits and advantages of the change, the fact that it's not yet there, you can always be skeptical about whatever benefit or advantage they would claim. And that can lead to insecurity or anxiety with respect to the change. Lack of communication. You're resistant to the change because nobody communicated something to you about the change. Okay? Or maybe there's some communication, but it wasn't clear. Okay? You had questions, but you didn't have an opportunity to raise those questions. Okay, so that is a potential source for you being resistant. The extent of the change. Maybe the change would happen for a long period of time that would really inconvenience you. Right? Instead of something that's like a yank of a band-aid, maybe it's something that's quite grueling. Okay? Then you'd probably resist the change, even if the benefits are really, really going to be fantastic. And there could be other factors, psychological factors or social factors, peer pressure. Uh, in some companies, if you're part of a union, perhaps, I mean, you would be concerned about solidarity or belongingness in the group. That can actually fuel your resistance at an individual level. But some of these factors would fall into the other types of resistance, such as group resistance, which we'll talk about now. Okay, and the possible reason why a certain group, a team, a department would be resistant to change is that there could be that fear, perhaps legitimate fear, that the cohesiveness and the existence of that group, that unit, that department is threatened. There will be group resistance. And at the level of the organization, the entire company, well, what are your possible reasons? Threat to power. Okay, your company might lose its position or its dominance in a particular field. Okay, that is going to be a reason why you wouldn't want to push for that change. Or group inertia. Maybe you're used to that idea of doing things as a group, as an organization, and then all of a sudden you're faced with something new. An example of which would be if you are going to attack or participate in a new industry. So that's something new, and you're probably used to the old industry. So you would have to go and learn about the new industry. You have to build new networks in that new industry. Well, because of the amount of effort required, you're probably going to say, no, we're not going to do this. Well, organizational structure is also a possible reason. The structure is not equipped. The structure is not receptive to any change that is being proposed. Okay, perhaps certain authorities or certain powers haven't been fully delegated, for example, in order for the change to take effect. Okay, that's one possibility. Well, another reason is threat to specialization. So perhaps, as you know, division of labor uh, brings specialization into the picture. But the moment that you start to understand that certain parts of the work are no longer needed or can be replaced by something else or someone else, then that can also be a threat. Okay. Maybe this is probably more pertinent to a group resistance, but this is something that even an organization would be resistant to. Okay. Especially if it's like a across the board threat to the division of labor that has been espoused originally. Of course, there are uh, resistances due to resource constraints. You don't have money, you don't have resources. I can't do the change because I have nothing. Okay. And we see that right now, especially in a pandemic where it has really affected the economies in many nations because there are resource constraints. Okay, there are resistances from the organizations to do something, to change dynamically. And another resistance to change organizationally is sunk cost, because you've already paid for those already, but the change would entail that you'll probably have to forego what you've spent for. You may have made some investments, and you realize that if you want to make this change, you are not going to capitalize on the investments anymore. They're going to be useless. Therefore, there's sunk costs. So of course you'll resist because you've spent time, energy, and money to invest in these resources, in the equipment or in hiring people, for example, and then all of a sudden you'll have to change course, change track. Of course, people might complain. We've spent so much time and effort and money for this. Why do we need to change? Okay, that's going to be a source of resistance. Now, how do we minimize the resistance to change? Now, if you're the change agent, you know that these are the many different types of resistances that you would encounter. How would you try to minimize change? Well, there are 5 areas wherein you can try to minimize the resistance to change. Well, first is communication. And I would say this is a very, very important component in getting buy-in. So that's the opposite of resistance to change, the idea of getting buy-in from the stakeholders. Okay? Communication. In fact, the typical tip is to over-communicate. When you have a change that you want to implement, it's not enough that you just simply, let's say, email everybody the information and forget it. No. No, you really have to keep on following up. You really have to insist and be redundant with the information. Because not all of them, at first instance, would appreciate and accept whatever it is that you've told them. So it's important that there has to be that constant discussion, constant dialogue about the change. Okay. And communication helps remove uncertainty. The point of view here is that communication is not about just disseminating information so that people understand. No. The whole idea why you want communication to be your top priority in getting buy-in and therefore minimizing resistance to change is because the act of communication engages everyone. They are being brought into the process. And later on, we'll talk about another factor, which is employee involvement. Okay. But one way to actually involve everyone is through communication, through that dialogue, through those question and answers, the town halls, the all hands, the open forums. Those are mechanisms in communication that would help actually build buy-in from everyone. Now, training is also another way to minimize the resistance to change. You provide new knowledge and skills. Maybe the reason why at an individual level they're resistant to it is because they don't know how to tackle it. They don't know what to do with it, so they're resistant to it. And training can include coaching and some action learning, trying to guide people as they're actually doing the activities. And by training, you're actually introducing that atmosphere to break old routines and slowly adapt to the new roles that's going to be expected from the change that's going to be implemented. Okay? Now, training is not going to be your catch-all. Okay, sometimes your training can be very, very long, but instead of encouraging people to adapt to the change, they sometimes feel tired about it, that they will actually resist all the more. They will say, too much training. Why do I need to keep on training? So there has to be a good balance. You want to provide training that's just right so that the people who need to buy in to the change are not disincentivized to actually adapt to the change. Now, the third item here is employee involvement. It increases the ownership of the change. So it's no longer the change agent that will be the agent or the one actively involved in the change. It's going to be everyone. So it increases the level of ownership. It expands the level of ownership and helps saving face and reducing fear of the unknown. Okay. So now everyone's involved. Everyone is participating to understand what the change is all about. And one way to express employee involvement would be including task forces, search committees, and even other things like open forums, all hands, as I said earlier, the town halls. These are your usual mechanisms to actually increase employee involvement. You can ask for volunteers even. Now, another way of trying to minimize resistance to change is negotiation. Really offering them something, offering them perhaps a reward if they go through the change. Or you, well, on the opposite side would be later on, and then the last part, which is on coercion. Maybe you'll propose something that is a removal of something negative. Okay, so that's also part of your negotiation. And typically, negotiation is important when people, the ones involved, will lose something if they don't go into the change. Okay, but they're still not supporting it. So it's very important that you really have to bring them in because they're not going to win, at least in those terms, right? It's not about winning or losing, right? Um, it's about the idea that you are still going to benefit something from the change, but if you won't let the change happen, there could be some other potential losses, right? And if you're left out, then there's nothing that the organization can probably do to bring you back in later on. Okay, so there's that threat in a way, right? And when we deal with negotiations, there's always going to be some sort of exchange, a quid pro quo, as they say, right? But negotiations happen. And normally this can be done through policies, changes in policies, temporary exceptions to the rules. These are examples of negotiation tactics. And lastly, coercion. I mean, there could be, you could force people to adapt to the change, whether you like it or not. This is like the last and certainly not the most recommended way of doing it. But if all else fails, especially if the existence of an organization is at stake, then coercion might be an option that should be considered. Either way. Okay. Now, when we look at change and we try to collect all of those changes together, then that actually leads to development or growth. Okay? And in that sense, you can appreciate a concept known as organizational development. So it's like a string or a set of changes that would happen to an organization. And OD, or organizational development, is a planned organization-wide continuous process designed to improve communication, problem solving, and learning through the application of behavioral science knowledge. So this is a little bit more specific in the sense that you're using psychology. You're using more of organizational psychology. You're using behavior, motivation theory to actually effect changes, improvements in the organization. And you use this through the usual tactics of communication skills or engaging people in problem solving activities, okay? Or even learning and development, okay? So that's also part of organizational development. Now, there are many models in OD. Okay, I'm going to share three possible models, okay, but there are many. And the whole idea there is that when you take a look at each of these models, you will understand that, well, one, it's about development, it's about growth, it's about changes. Okay. But how you navigate through the things that we've just talked about, especially the factors regarding resistance to change and how to minimize it, you will see those elements play out in each of the models presented here. Okay? And secondly, uh, you will understand that certain models are not exactly universal, right? Like I pick this model, and whatever organization I find myself in that model will be applicable to all. No, certain organizations would be not ideal for certain models, but some would be. So the whole idea there is that you'd want to have a broad perspective on what models are available, but at least you have to be confident that if you find yourself in a situation wherein you need to make some developments in your organization, you don't have to start from scratch. You can probably do a little bit more research on what models would be applicable to the organization you find yourself in. So let's take a look at the first model, okay, by Kurt Lewin. Okay, Kurt Lewin is a psychologist. He was born perhaps in the late 19th century and then did much of his work in the early 20th century. Did a lot in terms of organization and management theory. And for organizational development, he talks about unfreezing, changing or moving, and refreezing. Okay, so unfreezing, moving or changing, and refreezing. Now, Lewin's model is actually based on premises that before actually introducing a change in the organization needs to be prepared. Okay, and later on we'll talk about the unfreezing. Okay, the organization has to be motivated to change. Okay, and it has to be established that change is necessary. Okay, and the organization, okay, integrates the change into the behaviors within the organization. Okay, so that's the premise there. Now, if the premise of your organization, okay, doesn't fit with any of these assumptions, then the unfreezing, changing, refreezing model won't work or won't be applicable to your situation. Now, let's start with unfreezing. The whole idea of unfreezing is that as we've talked about change, we know change to be something that is that's moving from an old state to a new state. So if you want people to start moving from an old state to a new state, they need to unfreeze themselves from the old state. So that's the idea of unfreezing. Okay? You want to start moving out from status quo, from how you've been doing things. And this might mean that you need to unlearn certain things. You may need to stop doing things how it was. Okay. Uh, Discarding old behaviors. Okay. I mean, that's the whole idea of unfreezing. Whatever it is that you've been doing, stop. Don't do it anymore. Let's unfreeze from that state. Okay. Okay. Let's unfreeze. Okay. And the whole idea of unfreezing, that's not change itself yet. Right? It's just telling you that internally we need to have that mindset change. And primarily the only visible activity perhaps would be you'd stop doing things. Okay? So you'd have to stop doing the old way of doing things. Stop it. So you unfreeze yourself from that old state. And then you start changing. Now you make the change. Okay. So having unlearned everything, having adopted the idea that you need to stop the old behaviors, then you can come up with the new behavior. Okay? Efforts are made to substitute new attitudes, values, and behaviors for the old ones. Because you've moved away, well, not yet, you haven't started to move away yet. Because you've stopped doing the old way of things, it's easier for you now to adopt the newer ways. Okay? But that's the thing. Before you can change, you have to stop, okay, interiorly and even as an organization of the old way of doing things. You can't just simply apply the change, but people are still doing the old way of doing things. It doesn't really work. So you really need to have your people stop doing the change, sorry, stop doing the old ways first, and then apply the change. And then you refreeze. Okay? So now that the changes have been reintroduced to the organization, then you freeze the whole thing again. That's your new state. Okay? You need to freeze it because there's always going to be the tendency to go back to the old one. So in order to protect the gains from the change, you have to make sure that, okay, this is our new status quo. Whatever change that we've adopted, okay, we stick to it. We have to say goodbye to the old ways of doing things. In fact, some organizations, when they do the unfreezing, they actually sometimes, in a fanfare type of activity, they have ceremonies, symbolic ceremonies, to signify that the old way is completely gone, right? So, and it's good also psychologically for everyone and for the organization that they're actually going through this ceremony wherein the old way of doing things, we're no longer going to do it. But there's always that susceptibility to try to go back, especially now that you're able to compare the old with the new. Okay. Before, the resistance might only be theoretical, but now the resistance is based on actual experience. Now, in order to minimize resistance due to actual experience, you refreeze it. Okay, you refreeze your organization, say, okay, this is it. This is what we're going to do. We stick to it. And this helps provide stability and consistency within your organization. Okay. But it takes a lot of effort. It might require a little bit of policing. It might require a little bit of rewarding. Okay. But there has to be an active way to make sure that the changes that have been brought about is adopted completely, is something that's embraced by the entire organization. And that's where the refreezing comes in. Now, Larry Griener, okay, is another scholar that we can look into. He talks about the growth model. So when we talk about development, I mean, it implies growth. And what does Griner's model talk about? Well, change occurs in terms of certain sequential stages. Okay, so there's an external stimulus that forces or pressures management to initiate a change process. Okay, and the management, in response to the stimulus, is motivated to take actions to introduce the change in the organization. And following the actions, the various change stages occur in a sequential manner, such as diagnosing the problem, coming up with a solution, trying out the solution, and then reinforcing it with positive results. It's quite basic. Probably this is something that you may have seen also in other models, but from the perspective of the large organization, it has to be something that okay, you identify the problem, you fix the problem, try it out, then consolidate. Make sure that the solution is adopted broadly. Now, in Griner's idea, the change is triggered by something external, which may not always be the case. Okay. It can come from internal realities. Okay. In which case, Griner's model may not be applicable. Okay. But nevertheless, we'll take this model for what it is right now and then explore how it can be appreciated. So these are the stages in Griner's model, right? So, and it's sequential. So you have multiple phases, and in a way, it's also how we respond to change, right? It can be reactive or proactive. Griner's model is primarily reactive because it's based on stimulus. So when we talk about stimulus or stimuli, there's a reaction to that. So Griner's model is a reactive model. It's not proactive. It's not like in certain literature nowadays, wherein if you want to make change happen because of what is known as weak signals or anomalies in the market, okay, because there are anomalies, there's not enough credibility to make the change, right? Because it's a weak signal. But as we know, weak signals become stronger signals eventually. So rather than becoming reactive, you want to be proactive with the weak signals. So that is where Griner's model tends to be a little bit short, right? Griner's model is very reactive. But As a reactive model, it's followed sequentially. And the advantage of a sequential model is that it's easier for change to happen, right? It's not going to be complex as far as the process goes because it's reactive. Stimulus, reaction, stimulus, reaction, stimulus, reaction, stimulus, reaction. Straightforward, a little bit of a hassle, especially if you're in a crisis situation that is externally driven. Okay, that's a problem. But it's a feasible model. In Leavitt's model, okay, or the diamond model, and you'll see why it's called the diamond model, is also another model for organization development. So Leavitt's OD model is founded on the interactive nature, okay, or the dynamics of the elements within the systems. Okay, uh, and according to Leavitt's idea, okay, there are four interacting subsystems: tasks, structure, people, and technology. Because they are related to one another, because there's that certain interactivity with one another, the change in one can affect the other or others, as how the appreciation of the situation might be. Okay? And that's why Levitt's model is dynamic. Okay, it's not very linear as what you've seen with Griener's model. Okay, it's dynamic. Okay, a change in one area would automatically mean that certain changes in a certain proportion would happen in the other areas. Okay, and that's not going to be constant all throughout the organizations, right? Some organizations would have different effects, but the interactivity is still present. So this is how it looks like. Levitt's interactive model. Okay, so and therefore that's why it looks like the diamond, right? So all the interaction effects between each other by the four is presented as a diamond. Now the idea here is that not all factors or influences are the same in every organization. They can vary. Okay. What Levitt's model doesn't really tell you is the element of time, right? It just tells you the influences across the model or across the systems, but they don't tell you how much time or how much lag is present in the change. So, for example, in this picture, if there's a change, let's say under tasks, okay, and it would affect people, structure, and technology. Let's say they affect in equal proportions, right? You don't know whether the effect would be immediate or delayed. And you're not going to be sure whether the delay, if ever, would be consistent across all of other factors. Some other areas would feel the effects of the change immediately, while others would take such a long time. So the model doesn't really tell you how much or how fast the change can occur. It just tells you the interactivity of the change within a particular system. And with that, I end the short lecture on organizational change and development. This topic is actually quite broad, and I hope that while it's not a very exhaustive exposition of the topic, you would be encouraged to actually take a look at other models out there. Right now, the current field talks about weak signals, leadership as sense making, which actually affects organizational change. Or you can go a little bit further back in the 90s, wherein you have models by, for example, by John Cotter on how to create change, right? There are many models out there. And what's important is not all models would work in the same way, in the same fashion. It's up to you to find out which model would be appropriate for you. So that's pretty much it for this lecture. Are there any questions?